The chair was cold, the room was white, and the three officers behind the curved desk had not blinked in the 4 minutes since Milo Den sat down. He knew it was 4 minutes because the chrono strip embedded in the desk's leading edge pulsed once per second, and he had been counting. 240 pulses. He was 12 years old, and counting was something he did when adults wanted him to be afraid. "Cadet Den," said the one in the center. "Commander Sethan." A Vishari tall, angular, with skin the color of wet slate and 6 eyes arranged in 2 vertical triads along a face that narrowed to a lipless slit of a mouth. The Vishari did not gesture when they spoke. Their words came out clean, stripped of emphasis, like data read from a file. "You are aware that this review concerns the events of Module 7, Practicum Exercise 41. Milo said nothing. "You are aware," Sethan continued, "that 17 cadets were hospitalized, that the practicum arena sustained structural damage requiring a Class 4 repair allocation, that the tactical scenario you were assigned, designated quarantine collapse, was rated for 4th-year cadets with a minimum composite standing of 82, and that your composite standing at the time of the exercise was 61. 63, Milo said. It updated after Module 6 grading closed. The officer to Sethan's left a Drethani named Instructor Pelev, thin as a blade, with membranous ear frills that twitched when she processed new information, tapped the desk surface. A holographic transcript materialized between them, lines of text scrolling upward. The correction is noted, 63, still 21 points below the practicum's minimum threshold. 19, Milo said. Pelev's ear frills snapped flat. Excuse me. The minimum threshold is 82. 63 from 82 is 19, not 21. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. The third officer, a Kethari, thick-armed, with the double-hinged jaw and lidless amber eyes of the species, leaned forward. Subcommandant Resk. He ran the Skalem's tactical practicum wing, and he had the voice of someone who had been shouting orders for 30 years and had stopped bothering to lower the volume. Cadet, you are not here to correct arithmetic. You are here to explain why you deviated from the assigned parameters of a practicum exercise, endangered 17 cadets, and caused structural damage to a facility that has operated for 109 years without a Class 4 incident. Milo looked at Resk. The Kethari's jaw was set in the lateral spread that meant controlled anger. Milo had learned to read Kethari faces in his first week at the Kavesser Orbital Strategic Skalem, because the Kethari were the most common species here and they were, as a rule, the least patient with him. They were a species built for immediacy, fast-twitch muscle fibers, predatory reaction times, a neurological architecture that processed information in bursts rather than streams. Patience for a Kethari was not a virtue but a discipline, and Resk had clearly spent decades refining his. Milo respected that. He did not mistake it for kindness. He was the youngest cadet in the intake year, youngest by 3 years. The next youngest was a Drethani named Sorvin who was 15 standard and had already completed a pre-cadet technical program on her homeworld. The oldest was 24. The median age was 19. Milo was 12 and 4 months, and he had been admitted under the Skalem's exception protocol, a clause buried in the admissions charter that allowed a candidate of any age to enter if they passed the cognitive aptitude battery at the 99th percentile and received a sponsoring endorsement from a recognized military or academic authority. His sponsor had been Colonel Ada Den, Terran Combined Forces, retired. His mother, she had served 26 years in logistics command, had run supply lines through 3 theater conflicts, and had retired with the quiet distinction of someone who had never lost a convoy. She had signed the endorsement at the kitchen table on Mars, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a cup of coffee going cold beside the datapad. She had not asked him if he was sure. She had not told him it would be hard. She had driven him to the relay port, walked him to the boarding gate, and said exactly one thing before he boarded. "Don't let them decide who you are." Then she had turned around and walked back to the car without looking back. Milo had watched her go and understood, in the way that children of military parents understand things younger than they should, that she was not being cold. She was being precise. If she had looked back, he might have hesitated. And hesitation in his mother's operational vocabulary was the first syllable of failure. 7 months later, he was sitting in a white room explaining why he had done the thing he did. The practicum scenario was quarantine collapse, Milo said. Simulated outbreak aboard a station module. 30 AI-driven civilian avatars, 12 of them symptomatic. Tactical objective: contain the outbreak zone, triage the civilians, and hold the quarantine perimeter for 45 minutes until a relief detail arrives. Failure conditions: more than 6 civilian casualties, perimeter breach, or cadet incapacitation exceeding 50% of the assigned team. "We are aware of the scenario parameters," Sethan said. "Then you're aware that the scenario was not running to its published parameters when my team entered the arena." The chronostrip pulsed. Sethan's 6 eyes shifted, 3 tracking left, 3 holding center. "Explain." Milo had rehearsed this in his bunk the night before. Not the words, he did not script himself, but the sequence. The sequence mattered. If he told it out of order, they would hear excuses. If he told it in order, they would hear a report. At 7:40, my team Squad 11, 5 cadets reported to Practicum Arena 3 for Exercise 41. I was squad leader by rotation. The team was myself, Cadet Sorvin, Cadet Gale, Cadet Pollock, and Cadet Nurin. All second-year cadets, Pelev noted. All below the Practicum's stated minimum composite. Yes, we were assigned the exercise by Instructor Velak, who told us it was a modified version scaled for our level. When we entered the arena, the scenario that loaded was not modified. It was the full 4th-year variant. 60 civilian avatars instead of 30, 24 symptomatic instead of 12, relief detail timer set to 90 minutes instead of 45. And the outbreak agent was a Class 3 hemorrhagic pathogen with a 6-minute incubation window, not the Class 1 respiratory agent listed in our briefing packet. Resk's jaw clicked once hard. Milo continued. I identified the discrepancy within the first 90 seconds. The civilian count was wrong. I could see 60 avatars on the TAC display when the brief said 30. The pathogen behavior was wrong. Avatars were going symptomatic in clusters, not individually, which is hemorrhagic spread pattern, not respiratory. And the timer in the upper left corner of the display read 90, 00, not 45, 00. Why did you not abort? Sethan asked. Because Instructor Velak was monitoring from the control booth, and abort authority rests with the monitoring instructor, not the squad leader. I called abort on the squad channel at the 90-second mark. Velak denied it. He said the scenario was running as intended and that we should proceed. The holographic transcript flickered. Pelev swiped through it, ear frills twitching. The communication log confirms this. Cadet Den requested abort at 074132. Instructor Velak responded, negative. Scenario is within parameters. Proceed with the exercise. It was not within parameters, Milo said, and Velak knew it. The room temperature did not change, but something in the air did a tightening, as if the walls had drawn half a centimeter closer. Milo felt it the way he felt barometric drops before a storm, not with instruments, but with the animal part of his brain that had evolved on a world where weather killed you. Resk's voice was flat. That is a serious accusation, Cadet. It's a factual statement, Subcommandant. Instructor Velak loaded the 4th-year scenario intentionally. He had access to the arena's configuration panel. The scenario selection requires a manual override to load a variant above the assigned team's certification level. That override was logged at 7:38, 2 minutes before we entered. Velak's instructor credentials were on the log. Silence. Where did you obtain the configuration log? Pelev asked. From the arena's maintenance terminal after the exercise ended. The terminal is in the staging corridor. It is not restricted. You accessed a maintenance terminal. I read a screen that was powered on and visible. I did not bypass any security. Sethan's lipless mouth pressed into a thinner line. Set aside the question of Instructor Velak's actions. We will address that separately. What this review concerns is your actions during the exercise. Specifically, the 14-minute window between your denied abort request and the point at which the exercise was terminated by automated safety protocols. 14 minutes. Milo remembered every one of them the way he remembered the multiplication tables his mother had drilled into him when he was 6, not as data, but as architecture. A structure he could walk through, room by room, with his eyes closed. After the abort was denied, he said, I had 2 choices. Run the scenario as loaded and fail, because a second-year squad cannot hold a fourth-year perimeter for 90 minutes against a Class 3 pathogen with 60 civilians, or adapt the scenario to something we could survive. You chose to adapt. I chose to not let my team fail a test that was rigged against them. The word sat in the room like a stone, dropped in still water. Rigged, Resk repeated. Rigged, loaded above our certification, run without appropriate safety margins, monitored by an instructor who denied a valid abort request. If 5 fourth-year cadets had been in that arena, they would have struggled. 5 second years, youngest 12, average composite 67, had no statistical chance of completing the published objectives. Whoever loaded that scenario knew that. Pelev's frills were fully extended now, a Drethani stress display. She was not angry. She was processing. Describe your actions, Sethan said. Milo took a breath, not a deep one, just enough to reset. The published objective was containment. Hold the perimeter, triage civilians, wait for relief. That objective assumed the pathogen was manageable and the timeline was survivable. Neither was true. So I discarded the published objective and set a new one, evacuate. Evacuate, Resk said. The practicum arena does not have an evacuation protocol. The scenario is designed to test containment. The arena doesn't have an evacuation protocol. The station does. The practicum arena is a sealed module on Deck 14 of the Kavesar orbital. It has 4 bulkhead doors, 2 ventilation shafts rated for emergency egress, and a maintenance crawlway that connects to the service corridor on Deck 13. All of them are real. All of them function. The arena's simulation overlay maps onto the station's actual architecture. The designers did that deliberately so cadets learn to work in real spaces, not abstractions. You used real station infrastructure during a simulated exercise. I used real doors that were real doors. The simulation didn't lock them because the scenario designers assumed cadets would stay inside the scenario. Fourth-year cadets would. They're trained to treat the arena as a closed system. I'm 12. I haven't learned to stop noticing exits. There was something in the room that might have been the Cathari version of a held breath. At the 2-minute mark, Milo continued, the scenario's pathogen had already spread to 41 of the 60 avatars. The hemorrhagic variant moves through a population 3 times faster than the respiratory agent we were briefed on. The remaining 19 clean avatars had maybe 4 minutes before contact exposure converted them. In a real quarantine, that timeline means containment is no longer the objective. Containment assumes you can outrun the spread. When the spread is faster than your response, you evacuate. You made that assessment at the 2-minute mark, Pelev said. You're 12. The assessment is arithmetic, instructor. Spread rate times population density divided by response capacity. The math doesn't require a specific age to perform. Pelev's frills twitched once. She made no further comment. At the 3-minute mark, I split the squad. I had 90 seconds to brief them and get agreement. Nurin argued. She said the published objective was containment, that deviating would fail us automatically. I told her we were already going to fail the published objective. The question was whether we failed sitting still or failed while doing something that might actually work. She didn't agree. She went along because the squad leader's call is the squad leader's call. Cadet Nurin's objection is noted in her individual after-action report, Pelev said. She was right to object. She was wrong about the conclusion, but the objection was sound. That's the difference between disagreement and insubordination. Pelev's ear frills twitched. She made a note. Cadet Sorvin and Cadet Gale took the 32 ambulatory civilians, the ones who could walk, to Bulkhead 2, which connects to the Deck 14 main corridor. The ambulatory group was moving within 4 minutes of my order. Sorvin managed the routing. Gale handled the rear, keeping the avatars from scattering. He's Cathari, 2 meters tall, and the avatars were programmed to respond to perceived authority. A large figure at the back of a group moving toward an exit reads as an authority to most species templates, simulated or otherwise. You exploited the avatar's behavioral programming, Sethan said. I observed that it existed and used it, the same way the 4th-year scenario would have expected 4th-year cadets to use it for crowd management during containment. The tool was built in. I just pointed it in a different direction. Continue. I sent Cadet Pollock to the maintenance crawlway on the arena's north wall. She's Sorshi low, dense, 4-legged, with the best spatial mapping sense on the squad. Her job was to confirm the crawlway was passable, reach Deck 13 and signal back. She made it in 3 minutes. The crawlway was clear. And the 28 non-ambulatory civilians. Cadet Nurin and I handled them. 28 avatars, 2 cadets, one of whom is 12 years old. The avatars were non-ambulatory, not immobile. 12 could sit upright. 7 could crawl. 9 were fully incapacitated. The pathogen simulation had rendered them unconscious. We used the emergency ventilation shaft on the arena's west wall. Resk leaned forward, described the shaft. 1.4 meters in diameter. Metal-lined, angled at 12 degrees downward toward Deck 13. Too narrow for most species enrolled at this Skalem Cathari. Shoulder width exceeds the bore by 20 centimeters, Sorshi shell diameter by at least 15. Adequate for a Drethani. Adequate for a human. You selected an egress route that only your species and one other could physically use. I selected the only egress route that existed for the remaining civilians. The bulkheads were already in use. The crawlway was Pollock's route and too narrow for the avatar mass templates. The shaft was what was left. That's another thing my mother taught me, though she used different words for it. She said, the right answer is usually the one nobody wants to try. That's why it's still available. Resk's amber eyes moved to Sethan. A micro-glance held for a fraction of a second. Milo caught it. He caught most things. Go on. I rigged a dragline from the arena's medical supply locker. The nylon restraint webbing used for combative patients rated for 120 kilos of dynamic load, 3 meters per roll. I knotted 4 rolls together, fed the line through the shaft, and anchored the working end to my harness. Nurin loaded the avatars onto the webbing at the arena end. I went first, into the shaft, and pulled. You physically pulled 28 simulation avatars through a ventilation shaft, Resk said. They weighed between 40 and 70 kilos each, depending on the species template. The 12-degree angle meant gravity did part of the work, but the shaft lining had a friction coefficient that I hadn't accounted for. The cladding was textured for airflow management, not for dragging 100-kilo loads across it. The first 5 avatars moved cleanly. By the 6th, the webbing was catching on the texture ridges. By the 10th, I had to brace my feet against the shaft walls and pull with my whole body. Milo paused. He did not pause for effect. He paused because the next part was the part his body remembered better than his mind. His palms, even now, 3 days later, were covered in the regenerative patches that the medbay had applied after the exercise. The patches were transparent, and underneath them the new skin was pink and raw, and when he flexed his fingers in certain ways, the tissue pulled and reminded him that the body keeps its own record of events, separate from memory, stored in nerve endings rather than neurons. By Avatar 14, the skin on my palms had torn. The webbing has a woven edge that cuts under sustained load. I wrapped the line around my right forearm and switched to pulling with the bone. My left hand went flat against the shaft wall for braking. By Avatar 19, my vision started graying at the edges, oxygen debt, probably, combined with the exertion and the angle. The shaft air was adequate but not ideal. I was working at a rate my lungs couldn't quite sustain. "You continued," Sethan said, "not a question." The alternative was leaving them in the shaft. The simulation was still running. If I stopped, the avatars already in transit would remain in the shaft when the scenario eventually timed out or was manually terminated. The shutdown sequence would hit them wherever they were. Inside the arena, the shutdown is controlled. The energy dissipates through the arena's grounding system. Outside the arena, there's no grounding system. The energy goes into whatever's closest. If I'd stopped at Avatar 19, 9 avatars would have been in the shaft when the shutdown hit, and the energy discharge would have been concentrated in a shorter section of cladding. The damage would have been worse, possibly a full structural breach rather than a crack. Resk leaned forward. His thick forearm plates shifted against the desk surface, a gesture Milo had seen Cathari make when they were recalculating an assumption mid-conversation. "You're saying that continuing the extraction was the safer option." "I'm saying that stopping was also a decision with consequences, and the consequences of stopping were worse than the consequences of continuing. So I continued." Nurin fed them steadily from the arena end. She didn't pause, she didn't ask if I was all right, and she didn't slow down. I don't know if that was trust or efficiency. It worked either way. "The last 9 avatars," Pelev said, glancing at the transcript. "Cadet Nurin's report states you pulled them without stopping." "I stopped twice, once for 3 seconds to rewrap the line when it slipped, once for 3 seconds because my vision went fully gray and I needed to let the blood catch up. Then I kept going." Nurin may not have seen the stops from her position. The shaft curves at the midpoint. "The total extraction time." 8 minutes and 40 seconds. 28 avatars. Average of approximately 18.5 seconds per unit, including repositioning and reloading at the arena end. Resk made a sound low, involuntary. The Cathari equivalent of the noise a man makes when he reads a number he did not expect from someone he had written off. "Continue to the Cascade event," Sethan said. At the 11-minute mark, Sorvin opened Bulkhead 2. The 32 ambulatory avatars were in the corridor. At that moment, 2 things happened simultaneously. Inside the arena, the scenario's containment alarm triggered. It's a penalty mechanic, designed to simulate a breach consequence. But because the 4th-year variant uses hard integration with real station systems, the alarm didn't just register inside the simulation. It propagated to the station's central environmental monitoring array and triggered a Deck 14 quarantine lockdown. "The blast door sealed," Pelev said. Within 4 seconds, the corridor where Sorvin and Gale had moved the avatars, and where 17 cadets from 3 other practicum sessions happened to be passing between assignments, sealed at both ends. The quarantine protocol dropped the oxygen mix by 15% as a contamination countermeasure. Standard procedure for a real outbreak on a real deck. The system didn't know the outbreak was simulated. "How long until correction?" 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The station's automated diagnostic identified the alarm source as Practicum Arena 3, flagged the quarantine as simulation generated, and restored atmospheric balance. In that window, 17 cadets experienced acute hypoxia. 8 lost consciousness. All 17 were treated in the medical bay and released within 2 hours. 0 permanent injuries. And the structural damage. When the quarantine triggered, the arena's automated safety protocols initiated a simulation shutdown. The shutdown de-energized all holographic and force field elements in a controlled cascade, starting from the arena core outward. But 28 avatars were no longer inside the arena. They were in the ventilation shaft, suspended on my drag line, 18 of them still between the arena and Deck 13. The shutdown removed the force field scaffolding that gave the avatars their physical mass. The energy discharged into the shaft's interior cladding. It cracked a 3-meter section of the wall at the shaft's midpoint curve. That's the Class 4 repair. So you understand, Sethan said, that the structural damage was a direct consequence of your decision to move simulated assets outside the arena's designed containment. Yes. And you understand that the hypoxia incident was a direct consequence of your decision to breach the scenario's perimeter using real station infrastructure. Yes. Sethan folded his hands, all 4 of them, 2 over 2, a Vishari gesture Milo had never seen before but understood instantly. It was the posture of a decision being weighed. Then help me understand, Cadet Den, why you believe this review should conclude in any way other than your separation from the Skalam. Milo had expected the question. He had expected it not because he was clever, though he was, but because he had grown up in a house where a retired colonel ate dinner every night and talked about command decisions the way other parents talked about the weather. He knew what an institution looked like when it wanted someone to volunteer their own dismissal. They asked you to build the case against yourself. If you did it well enough, they could call it consensus. He was 12. He did not intend to build their case for them. Because I completed the exercise, he said. The room went still. The published failure conditions were more than 6 civilian casualties, perimeter breach, or cadet incapacitation exceeding 50%. Civilian casualties, 0. All 60 avatars were accounted for. 32 evacuated through Bulkhead 2 by Sorvin and Gale, 28 extracted through the ventilation shaft by Nurin and me. Perimeter breach, yes, but the perimeter was for a containment scenario I was not certified to run, loaded without my consent, against a pathogen I was not briefed on. Cadet incapacitation, 0. All 5 members of Squad 11 were ambulatory and conscious at exercise termination. The 17 cadets in the corridor were not part of my exercise. They were affected by a station system interaction that should not have existed because the scenario should not have been loaded. Their hypoxia is a consequence of the configuration error, not of my tactics. Resk leaned back. His jaw clicked twice, the Cathari processing rhythm. You're arguing that you completed an exercise you were not qualified to take, using methods the exercise did not contemplate. By exploiting infrastructure the designers assumed no cadet would touch. I'm arguing that I was put in an impossible situation by an instructor who loaded the wrong scenario, that I identified the threat, requested abort through proper channels, was denied, and then solved the problem with the resources available to me. That's what the Skalam teaches. That's what Module 1, Lecture 1 says on the first slide. A tactical officer's obligation is to the mission and the personnel under their command. When the mission parameters fail, the officer adapts. When adaptation is denied, the officer persists. Milo recited it from memory. He had memorized it on his first day because it sounded like something his mother would say, and because he had learned early that institutions respected their own words more than anyone else's. Pelev was looking at him the way a biologist looks at a specimen that has just done something outside the literature. You memorized the Module 1 preamble, she said. I memorized everything in Module 1, I memorize everything. That's why my cognitive aptitude score was in the 99th percentile. That's why I'm here. That is why you were admitted, Sethan said. Whether you remain is what this review will determine. Milo nodded. He understood the distinction. He respected it. He did not fear it. May I ask a question? He said. Sethan's eyes, all six, fixed on him. You may. Has Instructor Velak been asked why he loaded a fourth-year scenario for a second-year squad? The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. The earlier silences had been institutional, the pauses of a tribunal conducting its process. This silence was different. This silence was the sound of three officers who knew the answer and did not want to say it in front of a 12-year-old. Milo waited. The actions of Instructor Velak, Sethan said carefully, are the subject of a separate inquiry. They are not within the scope of this cadet review. But they are the cause of everything within the scope of this cadet review. Cadet Den. I'm not being insubordinate, Commander. I'm being precise. If the scenario had been correct, none of this would have happened. No quarantine alert, no hypoxia, no structural damage, no review. The only variable that separated a routine practicum from a station-wide incident was the scenario selection, and the scenario selection was made by Instructor Velak. I didn't choose the battlefield. I just didn't die on it. Resk made a sound. Low, guttural, the Cathari equivalent of a cough that was not quite a cough. Milo had heard it once before, from a Cathari upperclassman watching a first-year solve a navigation problem in half the allotted time. It was, he had learned, an involuntary expression of something between surprise and grudging respect. Resk did not appear to know he had made it. That was the most telling part. The noise had bypassed the subcommandant's 30 years of professional control and escaped into the room without permission. Sethan looked at Pelev. Pelev's ear frills were flat, compressed tight against her skull in the Drethani posture of deep thought. She looked back at Sethan and said nothing, which, in the language of tribunals, was a statement in itself. This review will recess, Sethan said. You will be notified of its conclusion within 48 hours. You are confined to dormitory and commons until that notification is delivered. Dismissed. Milo stood. His chair scraped against the floor, a small, human sound in a room designed for species that did not use chairs. He walked to the door. It opened silently, the way everything on the K-Vesser orbital opened, pneumatic, frictionless, engineered for beings who found mechanical noise primitive. The corridor outside smelled like recycled air and the faint mineral tang of the station's water reclamation system, the smell Milo had come to associate with the K-Vesser orbital the way he associated dry dust and iron oxide with Mars. Every place had a smell. Every place told you where you were before your eyes confirmed it. He took a breath, let the air settle in his chest, and looked left. Sorvin. The Drethani was leaning against the far wall with her arms folded across her narrow chest. Her membranous ear frills half extended in the posture Milo had learned meant alertness without anxiety. She was 15, taller than him by a head, with the pale, translucent skin of the polar Drethani subclade and eyes like chips of obsidian. She had been his squadmate for 7 months and his closest thing to a friend for 5 of them, though neither of them had used the word. How bad? Sorvin asked. They asked me to explain why I shouldn't be separated. Sorvin's frills twitched. What did you say? That I completed the exercise. You completed an exercise that was supposed to be impossible. All exercises are supposed to be impossible. That's what makes them exercises. Sorvin fell into step beside him. The corridor was long, curved, and lit by the Skalem's standard overhead panels, bright, clean, casting no shadows. The walls were polished ceramic composite, pale gray, and every 50 meters a holographic information display scrolled scheduled data and station advisories in 6 scripts. Milo could read 4 of them. He was working on the 5th. Velak loaded the wrong scenario, Sorvin said. It was not a question. Velak loaded the right scenario for his purpose, just not for ours. You think he did it deliberately? I think a 20-year instructor with override authority doesn't accidentally bypass a certification lock. The lock requires a 4-step confirmation sequence: scenario selection, certification check override, safety margin acknowledgement, and instructor of record authorization. 4 separate confirmations, each requiring a deliberate input. That's not an accident. That's a procedure. And then he denied an abort request when a 12-year-old told him the parameters were wrong. Accident would mean he made 4 consecutive errors and then a 5th. At some point, consecutive errors stop being errors and start being decisions. That's a pattern analysis, Sorvin said, not proof. No, but it's the kind of pattern that institutional reviews exist to examine. Which is why I told the review board exactly what the configuration log showed. Sorvin was quiet for 10 paces. Drethani processed silence differently than humans for them. Silence was not absence of communication but a distinct register, the way a musician uses a rest. When she spoke again, her voice was careful. Why would he want that? Because I corrected him in front of the class. The incident had been 3 weeks ago. Module 6, Tactical Theory. Velak had been lecturing on containment doctrine, the theory behind quarantine scenarios, as it happened, and had cited a case study from the Torvesi border incident. The containment cordon in that case had been breached because the field commander had underestimated the pathogen's environmental persistence by a factor of 3. Velak had presented it as a failure of nerve. The commander hesitated, the cordon fell, 1,100 died. Milo had raised his hand. The commander didn't hesitate, he had said. The after-action report shows she redeployed the cordon twice in the first hour. The breach happened because the pathogen was aerosolized by a thermal vent that wasn't on the geological survey. She didn't fail. Her data failed. Velak had looked at him. The Drethani instructor's ear frills had flared wide, a display that in most Drethani meant surprise, but in Velak, Milo had learned, meant something closer to territorial warning. And where did you read the after-action report, Cadet Den? The Skalam's archive. It's indexed under Torvesi border, subsection Tactical Review. It's not restricted. It is a 4th-year reference document. It's not restricted. The class had been very quiet. 46 cadets, 11 species, all of them watching a 12-year-old human correct an instructor who had been teaching tactical theory since before Milo's mother had enlisted. Velak had continued the lecture without responding. The incident had not been mentioned again. 3 days after the lecture, Milo's lab access had been restricted. Standard maintenance, the notification said. When he checked with the archive desk, his account had been flagged for review, a hold placed by an instructor with override authority. The flag expired after 72 hours with no action taken. Nobody mentioned it, but the message was delivered. You are being watched. Then Exercise 41. The 4th-year scenario, loaded like a mine under a footbridge, and 5 second-year cadets walking over it, because an instructor had decided that a 12-year-old who read restricted but not restricted documents needed to learn the shape of failure. He wanted to humiliate you, Sorvin said. He wanted to demonstrate that cognitive aptitude doesn't substitute for experience, and that a 12-year-old doesn't belong in a military academy. He's not wrong about the first part. The second part is the part I disagree with. They reached the dormitory wing. The doors were keyed to species, and mass class Milo's quarters were in the human-compatible section, which was a generous term for a room designed for beings between 50 and 100 kilograms with bilateral symmetry, and a tolerance for 21% oxygen. It was small, clean, and approximately the size of the walk-in closet in his mother's house on Mars. He had not complained about it because complaining was not something he did, and because the room had a window a real window, not a screen that looked out onto the gas giant the station orbited. And at 300 station time, the light from the giant's upper atmosphere came through the glass in bands of amber and violet that were the most beautiful thing he had seen in 7 months of being very far from home. Milo, Sorvin said, and the use of his first name meant this was not a tactical conversation anymore. If they separate you, what happens? I go back to Mars. I re-enter the Terran secondary education system. I'm 13 in 4 months. I'd be in the equivalent of 8th grade. 8th grade. It's a designation for the educational tier corresponding to the age of 12 to 13 in the Terran system. The curriculum includes introductory algebra, basic physical sciences, and a unit on ancient civilizations. I completed all of it when I was 9. Sorvin's frills rippled the Drethani approximation of a wince. That would be a waste. Yes. Then don't let them. Milo looked at her. I don't intend to. Sorvin nodded once, a gesture she had picked up from him, not native to Drethani body language, and walked away. Milo watched her go. Then he entered his room, sat on the edge of the bunk that was too large for him, and looked at the gas giant through the window. The confinement lasted 26 hours. Milo did not pace. He did not stare at the ceiling. He did not compose hypothetical appeals or draft messages to his mother or rehearse what he would say if the answer was separation. He had thought about all of those things during the first hour, examined each one the way he examined a problem set systematically, testing each branch for utility, and discarded them all. Appeals required data he did not have. Messages to his mother would arrive 11 months after the decision was made. Rehearsing for separation was preparing to lose, and preparing to lose was the beginning of losing. Instead, he read, not the Module 7 syllabus, he'd finished that in his second day at the Skalam. He read the Kavesar orbital's original engineering specifications, which were publicly available in the station's general archive. He read the atmospheric management protocols, the structural load ratings for every deck, the emergency egress plans that the station's original designers had written 109 years ago when the Skalam was still a military research outpost. He read the ventilation shaft specifications in particular detail, because he had crawled through one with bleeding hands, and he wanted to understand, retrospectively, how close the cladding had been to failure when the force field energy discharged. The answer was not very close. The cladding was rated for a Class 3 thermal event. The energy discharge had been equivalent to a Class 2. The 3-meter crack was cosmetic structural, technically, but within the repair and continue threshold. The shaft had not been in danger of collapse. He filed that. He filed everything. Filing was what humans did: accumulate, cross-reference, and wait for the moment when a fact became a tool. He also spent 40 minutes looking at the gas giant, not reading, not planning, just looking. The bands of amber and violet shifted in slow, enormous patterns that he could have modeled mathematically but chose not to, because some things were better left unquantified. His mother had taught him that too, though not in words. She had taught it by sitting on the porch of their house on Mars, after dinner, looking at the Terran-facing sky with a glass of something dark in her hand and her eyes on the horizon, and no words at all. Milo had sat beside her on those evenings and learned that silence could be a form of maintenance, a way of letting the machinery cool. He was 12. His machinery ran hot. He let it cool. On the second morning, a knock. Not Sorvin. The knock was too high on the door, which meant taller than a Drethani. Milo opened it. Gale. The Cathari cadet stood in the corridor, datapad in hand, jaw set in the neutral position that meant he was about to say something he had thought about carefully. Behind him, barely visible around the curve of the corridor, Pollak's Sorshi shell plates clicked once against the floor, the quadruped's equivalent of clearing a throat. We wrote a joint statement, Gale said, all 4 of us, Sorvin, Nurin, Pollak, and me, to the review board. Milo looked at the datapad. What does it say? that you identified the scenario error, that you communicated it to the team, that you called abort and were denied, that you made a command decision under conditions none of us were prepared for, and that all 5 of us walked out functional because of that decision. Nurin signed it. She added a note that she disagreed with the evacuation order at the time, and that she was wrong. Milo was quiet for a moment. He was 12 years old, and most of the social mechanics of group loyalty were still abstract to him, things he understood conceptually, but felt clumsily, like reading music he hadn't yet learned to play. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You didn't have to pull 28 bodies through a ventilation shaft for 8.5 minutes with your hands bleeding." Milo had no answer for that, so he said, "Thank you," because his mother had taught him that when someone does something for you and you don't know what else to say, gratitude is always structurally sound. Gale nodded. Behind him, Pollak's shell plates clicked again, twice this time rapid, which Milo had learned was the Sorshi equivalent of emphasis. He leaned past Gale and looked at the quadruped. "I checked the crawlway load ratings after we got out," Pollak said. Her voice was the characteristic Sorshi whistle drone, flat and precise, like a diagnostic readout given speech. "The maintenance passage I used to reach Deck 13, it was rated for my mass class, but only barely. If I had been carrying even one avatar, the structural monitor would have flagged it and sealed the passage automatically." "I know," Milo said. "That's why I sent you through alone. You were the confirm, not the extract." Pollak was still for a moment. Then her shell plates shifted in a ripple that moved from front to back, the Sorshi full-body nod, reserved for moments when a simple head nod, which Sorshi did not naturally perform, having no distinct head to nod, was insufficient. "You calculated the load limit before you assigned me." "I calculated it when I read the station specs in my first week. I didn't know I'd need it. I just knew it." Pollak's chromatophores, the pigment cells along her shell ridge that changed color with emotional state, shifted from their usual neutral gray to a muted teal. Milo had never seen that color on a Sorshi. He filed it. Teal. He would figure out what it meant later. The 3 of them stood in the corridor for another moment. Then Gale and Pollak left, and Milo closed his door and went back to reading about the thing he had crawled through. The notification came 2 hours later. Milo was in the Commons when it arrived, a shared space on Deck 12, where cadets from all intake years could study, eat from the dispensary, and engage in the careful social negotiations that pass for leisure in a military academy populated by a dozen species with incompatible ideas about personal space. He was sitting at a corner table with his datapad, reading a technical manual on station ventilation systems that he had requested from the Maintenance Division's open library. He was reading it because it was there, and because after pulling 28 avatars through a ventilation shaft, he had become interested in the engineering of the thing he had crawled through. The notification arrived on his datapad, Scalem Seal, timestamp 914, 2 paragraphs. "Cadet Den, Milo J., this review board finds that your actions during practicum exercise 41, while resulting in collateral damage to station infrastructure and a cascading atmospheric incident affecting 17 cadets, were conducted under anomalous conditions not of your making. The board notes that you identified the scenario discrepancy, requested abort through proper channels, were denied, and subsequently executed a tactical adaptation that preserved all 60 civilian simulation assets and all 5 members of your assigned squad. The board does not endorse your methods. The board does, however, acknowledge that the methods were effective and that the conditions under which they were employed are the subject of a separate institutional inquiry. Your separation review is suspended. You are restored to full cadet status. A notation will be placed in your file regarding the unauthorized use of station infrastructure during a training exercise. This notation carries no disciplinary weight. Additionally, the board notes receipt of a joint statement from Cadets Sorvin, Gale, Pollack, and Nurin, in support of your command decisions during the exercise. This statement has been entered into the record." Milo read it twice. He set the datapad down and looked across the commons. The room was half full, cadets at tables, cadets at the dispensary wall, cadets moving between groups with the unconscious hierarchies that every institution developed and none acknowledged. 2 Cathari at a nearby table were watching him. They had been watching him since he sat down. One of them was Resk's student aide, which meant the sub-commandant's office had already circulated the result. The Cathari aide met Milo's eyes. The double-hinged jaw shifted a micro-motion, barely visible. Not the lateral spread of amusement, not the click of anger, something smaller, more grudging, harder to name. Then the aide looked away and went back to eating. Milo's datapad chimed again. A second message. Different seal, not the review board but the Scolam's curriculum division. Cadet Den, Milo J. effective immediately. Practicum exercise 41, quarantine collapse, 4th year variant, will be reclassified as a joint certification scenario. Teams of mixed certification level will be permitted to attempt it under modified safety protocols, including hard-lock simulation overlays on all station infrastructure interfaces, dedicated abort authority for the squad leader independent of the monitoring instructor, and a mandatory pre-exercise briefing on the scenario's integration with real station systems. The modifications are a direct result of the institutional review initiated by the events of your exercise. You are not being credited for this change. You are being informed of it. He read it 3 times. Not credited, informed. The Scolam's way of saying, "We heard you, we will not say so, and we will not say thank you." A third chime. This one was not a formal notice. It was a brief internal communication from the office of Sub-Commandant Resk, marked administrative. Cadet Den, Instructor Velak, has been reassigned from the Tactical Practicum Division effective this morning. This is provided for your awareness only and requires no response. Milo looked at the 3 messages on his screen. The acquittal, the protocol change, the reassignment, 3 institutional actions, each phrased to avoid acknowledging that a 12-year-old had been right about everything: the sabotage, the unsafe conditions, the failed containment doctrine, the exits that nobody else had thought to use. He looked at the ventilation grill above his table. Standard Kavesser orbital design, modular, rectangular, 32 centimeters by 40 centimeters, secured by 4 magnetic clamps rated for Class 2 atmospheric events. He knew its specifications now. He knew the grade of the cladding, the load tolerance of the shaft walls, the airflow rate at standard and emergency pressure differentials. He knew these things because he had been inside one, pulling bodies through it with bleeding hands, counting seconds because counting was what he did when the world wanted him to be afraid. He closed all 3 messages and opened the ventilation manual. The commons filled slowly around him. Cadets entered in 1s and 2s, morning study blocks ending, the day's first breaks beginning. A group of Vishari cadets took the long table near the dispensary, their movements synchronized in the unconscious way that Vishari always moved in groups, 6-eyed faces oriented toward the same focal point. A pair of sorshi rolled past on their low-slung frames, shell plates clicking against the floor. A Cathari cadet stopped at the dispensary, collected a nutrient block, and paused to look at Milo with the evaluating stillness that was either suspicion or curiosity. Milo had learned to stop trying to distinguish between the two in most alien species. Suspicion and curiosity looked the same when directed at a human child in a room full of adult soldiers from 11 worlds. Sorvin arrived at 9:30. She did not ask. She looked at his face, read something there, and sat down across from him. "Restored," she said. "Restored, Velak's been reassigned, and they changed the practicum protocols." Sorvin sat straighter. "Changed how?" "Squad leaders can call abort now, independent of the instructor. Hard-locked simulation overlays on station infrastructure. Mandatory pre-exercise briefing on system integration. The whole exercise 41 has been reclassified. Sorvin's frills compressed and then extended in rapid sequence. A Drethani display Milo had never seen her make before, halfway between controlled surprise and fierce approval. They rebuilt the exercise because of what happened. They rebuilt it because what happened exposed a design flaw. The fourth-year variant assumed nobody would use the real infrastructure during a simulation. That's a bad assumption. Any assumption about what people won't do under pressure is a bad assumption. My mother said that once. She was talking about a resupply convoy, but the principle holds. Sorvin's frills extended slowly, the Drethani expression of something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the space between them. You changed the protocols. I'm not being credited. You changed them. Milo looked at his datapad. The technical manual on ventilation systems was still open. He closed it. You know what my mother told me before I came here, he said. You've never mentioned your mother. She said, don't let them decide who you are. Did she know what this place would be like? She was a colonel. She knew what every place like this is like. She ran supply convoys through contested space for 9 years. She told me once that the hardest part of command wasn't the enemy, it was the institution behind you that wanted you to fail quietly enough that they didn't have to write a report. Sorvin's frills shifted. Your mother sounds like someone who would have survived exercise 41. She would have figured out the ventilation shaft faster than I did, and she wouldn't have torn her hands. She wore gloves. Sorvin almost smiled. Drethani smiles were subtle, a compression of the lower mandible, a slight widening of the obsidian eyes, but Milo had learned to read them over 7 months of proximity, and this one was real. And who are you, Milo Den? He looked at her. 12 years old, 5'1", 92 pounds, sitting in a military academy designed for species twice his size in a chair that was too tall for his feet to reach the floor. He had pulled 28 simulation avatars through a ventilation shaft with his hands until the skin came off. He had corrected an instructor in front of 46 cadets because the instructor was wrong. He had sat in a white room and answered questions without flinching, and when they asked him to argue for his own dismissal, he had argued for the truth instead. I'm the cadet who completed the exercise, he said. First period was about to begin. Around them, cadets gathered their materials, finished their nutrient blocks, stood and moved toward the corridor in the unhurried flow of an institution that ran on schedule and treated punctuality as a moral position. Gale was waiting at the Module 7 lecture hall entrance. The tall Cathari cadet stood to the side of the doorway with his datapad against his chest and watched Milo approach. You're back, Gale said. I'm back. Velek. Reassigned this morning. Gale's jaw did the thing. The small lateral shift that was not amusement and not anger, something younger, rower, less practiced. Recognition, maybe. Good, Gale said. Then quieter, he deserved worse. Milo did not respond to that. Velak was a problem that had been solved by an institution doing what institutions do slowly, formally, without admitting fault in any direction that could be quoted. Whether the Drethani instructor deserved worse was a moral question, and Milo was 12, and moral questions required more data than he currently had. He would revisit it when he was older. Nurin told me about the drag line, Gale said. She said you pulled the last 9 without stopping. I stopped twice, once to rewrap the line, once because my vision went gray and I needed 3 seconds, then I kept going. She said you didn't. I stopped twice. She might not have seen it from her position. Gale was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped aside, and Milo walked into the lecture hall. The room was a curved amphitheater, tiered seating for 60. the instructor's platform at the bottom ringed by a holographic display array. Milo took his usual seat, third row from the front, far left, where the sight lines were clean and the holographic projections had the least distortion. He had tested every seat in the first week and selected this one for those reasons. 3 Vishari cadets in the row behind him had initially objected to having a human in their peripheral vision. Vishari, 6-eyed visual fields processed motion differently, and a small figure at the edge of their lower triad registered as potential threat until habituated. But by the 3rd week they had stopped noticing, and by the 5th they had started saving the seat for him when he was late. Today the seat was empty and waiting. The Vishari in the row behind shifted slightly as he sat down, an almost imperceptible adjustment of posture, 3 of 6 eyes tracking him briefly before returning forward. Not the old reflex anymore. Something else. Something that might have been awareness of what the small figure in the 3rd row had done in a practicum arena 3 days ago, and what it had cost the small figure's hands, and what it might cost the institution's assumptions. He sat. He opened his datapad to the Module 7 syllabus. The first reading was a case study on adaptive command in resource-denied environments, written by a Sorshi fleet commodore who had held a supply depot for 11 days with no functioning communications, and a crew of 64, 19 of whom were injured. The commodore had survived by improvising, delegating, and refusing to acknowledge the possibility of failure until failure was the only option left, and then improvising again. Milo read the first page, then the second. The Commodore's account of the 3rd day, when 2 of the injured crew died from infections that the compromised med bay could not treat, and she had ordered the bodies stored in the cold hold. Because burial rites required gravity, they did not have struck something in him that was not intellectual. It was the recognition of a moment he understood from the inside. The point where the plan stops working and you keep going anyway, not because you believe it will succeed, but because stopping requires a decision and deciding to stop requires energy, and all your energy is already spoken for. He had been in that moment on the drag line, Avatar 22. The webbing biting into his forearm, the skin beneath it already an abstract concept, something that existed but had been reclassified as non-essential. His vision narrowing, his shoulders operating on a frequency below conscious control, the muscle memory of pulling overriding the higher brain assessment that pulling was no longer advisable. He had not decided to keep going. He had simply not decided to stop. The distinction mattered. Decisions required resources. Continuation required nothing but the absence of a decision to do otherwise. The Commodore had written it differently. She had called it operational inertia. Milo liked the phrase. He filed it. The substitute instructor entered. A Vishari younger than Sethan, with the same angular features and the same 6-eyed gaze, but without the tribunal stillness. This one moved like someone who had recently been pulled from research and was not entirely comfortable lecturing to cadets who could, in some cases, physically eat the instructor. Module 7, the substitute said, Tactical Adaptation Under Constrained Resources. Open your case studies. We begin with the Sorshi Depot siege. Milo was already on page 4. The lecture ran for 90 minutes. The substitute was competent if uninspired, methodical where Velak had been authoritative, careful where Velak had been cutting. Milo absorbed the content, cross-referenced it against his own experience in the ventilation shaft, the constrained resources, the improvised tools, the refusal to accept the published parameters as final, and annotated his datapad with notes that were less about the case study and more about the gap between what institutions taught and what individuals did when the teaching ran out. At the lecture's end, the substitute paused, looked around the room. 60 faces, 11 species, 1 human child in the 3rd row who had not looked up from his datapad in 90 minutes. Before you leave, the substitute said, an institutional notice. Effective this week, Practicum Exercise 41 has been reclassified and its safety protocols revised. The details are in your SCOLEM bulletin. The revision includes a new provision granting abort authority to squad leaders independent of monitoring instructors. The room was quiet. Most cadets did not know the context, but the ones who did, Sorvin, 2 rows back, her ear frills perfectly still. Gale at the end of the row, his jaw set. Pollock in the 4th tier, shell plates drawn tight. Nurin in the middle, her sharp Drethani face carefully blank. The ones who did know looked at Milo. Milo did not look up. He did not need to. He could feel their attention the way he could feel changes in air pressure, not as a physical sensation but as a shift in the room's equilibrium. The room knew. The room was recalibrating. Not dramatically, not with any outward display, but in the quiet way that large groups recalibrate when a piece of information has been absorbed and the social geometry has shifted by a few degrees. He was still the youngest. He was still the smallest. He was still the one whose feet did not touch the floor. But the angle at which the room regarded him had changed, and the change was permanent, and Milo knew it the way he knew the ventilation shaft's bore diameter, not because someone told him, but because he had measured it himself. He closed his datapad, stood, and walked out of the lecture hall at the same pace he walked everywhere. Steady, unhurried, feet not quite reaching the floor when he sat but covering ground efficiently when he moved. A 12-year-old gait, unself-conscious. Not trying to look older or taller or harder than he was. In the corridor, the overhead panels cast their shadowless light. The chrono strip on the wall read 11:05. The station hummed with the low, constant vibration of systems that never slept: recyclers, gravity generators, atmospheric processors, the 10,000 engineered heartbeats that kept 3,000 beings alive in a metal shell orbiting a planet made of storms. Milo walked through it without looking at any of it, because he had memorized the route on his 2nd day, and because looking at things you already understood was a form of hesitation, and hesitation was something he had decided, on a ventilation shaft drag line with blood on his hands and light fading at the edges of his vision, that he did not have time for. 2 Vishari upperclassmen stepped out of a side corridor ahead of him. They were 3rd years. He recognized the tactical assessment insignia on their collars, the silver bar that meant they had passed the module. Milo was just beginning. One of them glanced down at him as he passed. The Vishari's 6 eyes tracked independently, 3 on Milo, 3 forward, the biological multi-tracking that made Vishari exceptional surveillance operatives and deeply unsettling conversational partners. "That's the human," the Vishari said to his companion, not quietly, not loudly. The flat, uninfected register of a species that did not bother with volume modulation, because all 6 of their eyes told them exactly who was listening. The one from the practicum incident. The one who crawled through a ventilation shaft and broke the station. Milo kept walking. He did not speed up. He did not slow down. He did not turn to look at them, because turning would have been a response, and a response would have been an acknowledgement, and an acknowledgement from a 12-year-old would have been read as either defiance or insecurity, and he was neither. He was a cadet walking to his dormitory after a lecture, and everything else was commentary. Behind him, the 2nd Vishari said something he did not catch. Then silence. Then the sound of 2 sets of footsteps moving in the opposite direction. He had 4 more years at the Kavesar Orbital Strategic SCOLEM. 4 years of modules, practicums, and instructors who might underestimate him and instructors who might not. 4 years of chairs too tall and bunks too wide, and a dormitory room that was exactly the right size for a human child who did not need much space, because the space inside his head was vast and organized and never still. He would grow during those 4 years. Taller, heavier, broader in the shoulders that had already learned what it felt like to pull weight through a metal tube until the skin came off. He would learn things the curriculum intended and things it did not. He would memorize more case studies, more protocols, more specifications of systems he might someday crawl through. He would sit in more rooms with officers behind curved desks, because that was what institutions did to people who did not fit the shape the institution expected. And Milo Den was not shaped like anything the Kavesser orbital had filed before. His mother had said, "Don't let them decide who you are." The Skalem had tried. The review board had tried. Velak had tried hardest of all, loading a scenario like a loaded weapon and pointing it at a 12-year-old's career to prove a point about what belonged and what did not. Milo Den was still here. He walked into the corridor's long curve, datapad under his arm, the gas giant's light finding the window at the corridor's end, and painting one thin stripe of amber across the polished floor ahead of him. He stepped into it, through it, and kept walking. The exercise was done. The next one was waiting. He was 12 years old, and he was not finished.